Today, you and I are going to look at 7 Australian breads that look like wholemeal, but when you flip the label, they are basically white bread dressed up in brown. Because right now, Coles, Woolworths and the big brands are selling loaves that get their healthy look from colouring, malt and a sprinkle of grains, while the main ingredient is still refined white flour. Stay with me, because after we walk through the 7 worst patterns, we will go through 2 simple tricks and a few better loaves that are actually worth putting in your trolley. When most Australians think they are being good with bread, they do not grab the cheapest white sandwich loaf. They grab something brown, wholemeal, multigrain, country style. It feels like the grown-up choice. For years, we have been told that wholemeal and wholegrain breads are better for energy, digestion, and heart health, and that is true when it is real wholegrain. But this is the part most Australians never see. A lot of so-called brown and multigrain breads on the shelf are built on the same refined white flour base, with a bit of bran, some seeds, and a darker colour added, so they look healthier than they really are. Nutrition writers often explain that multigrain bread is usually white flour with a mixture of whole grains added, basically white bread with some grains sprinkled in. Experts from different countries warn that many commercial brown breads are literally white bread with caramel colour or molasses added to turn the crumb brown. Australian nutrition advice also notes that in some places brown bread has been coloured, and that while clearer labelling and standards reduce the worst examples here, multigrain loaves are still often mostly white flour in disguise. So let us flip that label around for a second, because what you are about to hear changes the way you look at that healthy-looking brown loaf sitting on your bench. Number 1. Coles and Woolworths multigrain sandwich loaves that are mostly white flour with some seeds. Walk into any Coles or Woolworths and you will see a wall of multigrain loaves from big brands and supermarket home brands. Thick slices, seeds on top, golden brown crust. The packaging shouts grain, country, high fibre, low glycemic index. It looks like the smartest choice in the aisle. But nutrition experts are very direct about what multigrain usually means. Australian guidance explains that multigrain bread is often made with white flour, with a mixture of grains such as wheat and rye added, basically white bread with added grains. You can see this in real products. A Woolworths multigrain soft sandwich bread lists wheat flour as the first ingredient, followed by water and then mixed grains that make up only a small share of the dough. A Coles Bakery multigrain sandwich loaf lists wheat flour first as well, with mixed seeds and grain making up less than a quarter of the recipe. The fancy grains are there, but the main ingredient is still refined wheat flour. Here is where it stops making sense. On the front of the pack, you will see words like grain and rustic farm-style imagery. On the back, the first ingredient is usually just wheat flour, which in Australian labelling normally means white flour from the endosperm only, without the bran and germ of the full grain. So you get a white flour base that behaves in your body very similarly to white bread, and a handful of grains or seeds mixed through, so it looks rustic and wholesome. Sometimes there is a bit of malted barley flour or a similar ingredient to deepen the colour. The label suggests whole and grain. What it really means is white bread with decorative bits added. So why is this a problem? Because if you are grabbing multigrain to get the benefits of real wholemeal, more fibre, more micronutrients and slower release energy, you are mostly getting the same refined flour that can raise your blood sugar in a similar way to white toast, with a few grains as garnish. If you have ever bought multigrain thinking it was a huge upgrade from white, you are not alone. If this is already in your trolley, do not panic. But next time, here is what I would do instead. Flip the loaf over and check the first ingredient. If it just says wheat flour and does not say wholemeal or whole grain wheat flour first, you are looking at white bread in a multigrain costume. And if that is the game with multigrain, number 2 is where wholemeal style supermarket breads start to blur the line even more. Number 2. Wholemeal-style supermarket loaves from Coles and Woolworths bakery ranges with white flour and malt in the mix. Some supermarket breads go a step further. They do not just say multigrain. They lean into phrases such as wholemeal style, brown, country grain or high top, and show a rich brown crumb on the pack. But here is the part nobody talks about. When you look at ingredient lists for many supermarket wholemeal-style loaves, including in-house bakery breads from Coles and Woolworths, you will often see a pattern that looks something like this. Wholemeal wheat flour, but not necessarily the only flour. Then plain wheat flour, which is white. Then extras like malted barley flour and rye meal to add flavor and color. In these mixed loaves, less than all of the flour is wholemeal, with the rest made up of refined white flour and additions such as malted barley flour, which is often used for flavor and color. Let us flip that label around for a second. On the front, the loaf looks dark and hearty. On the back, it is technically a mixed loaf, part wholemeal, part white, and plus ingredients such as malted barley flour that can deepen the color and give that brown look. This is not the old-style white bread dyed brown with obvious caramel color that has been reported in some overseas markets. Australian nutrition commentary notes that clearer labeling and standards here reduce the most extreme examples of colored brown bread. But that does not mean the visual trick is gone. Now, instead of only using clear color additives, loaves can rely on malted flours and a partial mix of wholemeal to create a brown crumb, even when the recipe is still heavily based on refined flour. So, why does that matter? Because the color of your bread is no longer a reliable guide to how much whole grain you are actually getting. The brown look can come from malt or just a modest percentage of wholemeal rather than a fully whole grain base. If you have ever thought it is brown so it must be better, this is where that assumption breaks. If this is already your go-to wholemeal loaf from a supermarket bakery, do not panic, but next time, look at the percentage of wholemeal flour in the ingredient list. If it is only around half and the rest is just plain wheat flour, you are not getting the full whole grain deal you think you are. And if that is how supermarket brands blur the line, number 3 is where light rye and country rye take the distortion further. Number 3, light rye breads from major supermarket and package brands that are mostly white flour with rye and color for show. Light rye, country rye, soft rye sandwich. The name sounds European, traditional, and even a bit medicinal. Plenty of Australians grab these loaves from big bread brands and supermarket bakeries thinking they are moving away from plain wheat and making a big gut health upgrade. But here is where things get uncomfortable. Typical light rye breads on Australian shelves are often built on the same white wheat flour base, with relatively small amounts of rye meal or rye flour added, along with ingredients such as malted barley flour to darken the crumb. Nutrition writers warn that many rye and brown breads in general are actually refined wheat bread with caramel color or malt added to create a darker look, not genuine high rye recipes. So you get a mostly refined wheat bread underneath, a bit of rye meal sprinkled in to justify the name, and a slightly darker color that suggests more fiber and more grain than you are really getting. Let us flip that label around for a second. If the first ingredient on your light rye from a big supermarket brand is wheat flour, and rye only shows up further down the list, you are not eating a true rye bread. You are eating white bread with some rye added, and often with a darker look, baked in through malt or similar ingredients. So why is this a problem? Because real rye bread is usually denser, higher in fiber, and has a different effect on blood sugar than pure white bread. But if the loaf is mostly refined wheat, your body is not seeing the rye promise on the front. It is seeing the white flour reality on the back. If you have ever bought a light rye thinking you were being very responsible with your sandwiches, you are not alone. If this is already your regular choice, do not panic, but next time, check whether the label says rye flour first or whether it says wheat flour first, with a bit of rye tucked away further down the list. Because if you thought that was bad, number 4 shows how even soft wholemeal brands can hide behind processing. Number 4, soft wholemeal breads from large brands, such as Tip Top, that are very processed and barely textured. Now let us talk about the big soft wholemeal brands on Australian shelves. Thick, soft slices, gentle crust, marketed as soft for children, easier to eat and perfect for sandwiches. These loaves often do contain a high proportion of wholemeal flour. For example, Tip Top Sun-Blessed soft wholemeal and wholemeal sandwich loaves list whole grain wholemeal wheat flour as the very first ingredient, making up about half or a bit more of the flour in the recipe. So, what is the problem? This is where the fake wholemeal idea shifts from obvious color tricks to processing tricks. According to food standards in Australia and New Zealand, wholemeal flour must contain all parts of the original grain, including endosperm, germ, and bran, in their original proportions. But that rule does not say anything about how finely that flour is milled. When you mill wholemeal very finely and then combine it with added gluten, emulsifiers, and oils, as big brands often do, you can create a loaf that looks brown, feels as soft and fluffy as white toast, and has almost none of the chewy, grainy texture that people associate with traditional wholemeal. The marketing suggests wholemeal goodness with soft white style texture. What it really means is wholemeal ingredients put through an industrial process so they behave more like white bread in your mouth, and in some cases in your bloodstream. So why does this matter? Research has shown that not only the type of flour, but also the particle size of that flour affects how quickly it digests. Very finely milled wholemeal can raise blood glucose more quickly, more like white flour, than coarse whole grain with larger particles. Australian nutrition sources point out that whole grain breads with visible intact grains generally have more fiber and a lower impact on blood sugar than very soft, finely milled wholemeal products. If you have ever wondered why your soft wholemeal loaf from a big brand behaves a lot like white bread, quick to toast, quick to chew and gone in 2 bites, this is why. If this is already your family's everyday loaf, do not panic. It is still usually better than pure white bread. But next time, here is what I would do instead. Look for wholemeal or whole grain loaves with visible grain texture and fewer emulsifiers rather than the ultra-soft, highly processed ones that have been engineered to look brown but act more like white. And if softness can be used to hide the truth, number 5 is where gluten-free brown breads pull a similar trick with color. Number 5. Gluten-free brown breads from major supermarket and specialist brands made from refined starches and colored grains. Gluten-free bread is essential for Australians with celiac disease or diagnosed gluten sensitivity. This is not about scaring anyone away from food they medically need, but here is the part nobody talks about. A lot of gluten-free brown or mixed grain loaves, including supermarket private labels and specialist brands, are built on a base of refined starches such as tapioca starch, maize starch, potato starch and rice flour, with a small amount of grains or seeds added for image. The ingredients list on a typical gluten-free mixed grain bread might read like this: water, modified tapioca starch, rice flour, maize starch, grains such as corn and quinoa, seeds, potato starch, oil, sugar, and a list of thickeners and additives. Notice what is missing. There is no whole grain wheat, rye or spelt, which makes sense because it is gluten-free. But there is also very little whole grain of any type compared with the refined starch base. Let us flip that label around for a second. The loaf looks brown. The words mixed grain and seeds sound hearty, but the reality is mostly refined starches that act a lot like white flour once digested. A bit of whole grain and seeds sprinkled in to justify the grain name, and sometimes added sugar and oil to make the texture pleasant. So why is this a problem? because plenty of Australians without celiac disease are buying gluten-free brown bread, thinking it is automatically healthier. In reality, you are often swapping regular flour for refined starch, sugar, and a long list of additives. Australian health authorities regularly explain that if you do not medically need a gluten-free diet, gluten-free does not automatically mean healthier. And from a fiber and nutrient point of view, it can even be less favorable. If this is already in your trolley and you are gluten-free under medical advice, do not panic. Simply aim for the loaves that actually use higher levels of whole pseudograins and seeds, and not just starch and color. If you are buying it purely because it looks brown and sounds healthier, I would think twice. Because number 6 is where brown burger buns and wholemeal rolls show how far the visual trick can go. Number 6. Wholemeal burger buns and rolls from Coles. Woolworths and other big brands with tiny wholemeal content. Open the bakery section and you will see wholemeal burger buns, wholemeal dinner rolls and brown sub-rolls from Coles Bakery, Woolworths Bakery, and major packaged brands lined up next to their white versions. Same shape, same softness, just a nice tan color and a healthier sounding label. But if you look closely at many of these packs, you will notice that the first ingredient is still wheat flour, meaning white flour, that wholemeal or whole grain flour appears further down the list in smaller percentages, and there may be malted barley flour or similar ingredients that deepen the crumb color. Nutrition writers from overseas warn that this is one of the oldest tricks in commercial baking. Add a bit of caramel color, molasses, or malt to a white flour dough, and you get a convincing brown bread without much real whole grain content. Australian commentary suggests that very obvious use of caramel colour alone to fake brown bread is less common here than it once was in some other markets, thanks to food standards and labelling. However, there is nothing that stops manufacturers from using a mostly white flour base with a small amount of wholemeal and some malty ingredients to deliver a darker roll. So why should that make Australians raise an eyebrow? Because when you switch your children from white burger buns to wholemeal buns for school lunches, you probably think you have made a major fiber upgrade. If the loaf is still mostly white flour underneath, that is not really happening. You end up paying extra for a bun whose main job is to look healthier, not to behave like a true wholemeal product in the body. If these are already part of your weekly barbecue routine, do not panic. But next time, check whether the label actually tells you the percentage of wholemeal flour. If wholemeal wheat flour is under half of the flour content, or appears after plain wheat flour, you are mostly buying color and marketing. And if buns can be more brown than whole grain, number 7 shows how the entire brown bread equals healthy bread idea falls apart. Number 7. Any brown or wheat bread from big Australian brands where the first ingredient is not wholemeal or whole grain flour. The final pattern on this list is not one logo. It is a rule. Any brown-looking wheat-style or country bread in Australia from supermarket bakeries or major brands where the first ingredient is not wholemeal or whole grain flour should make you suspicious. Australian labelling rules and the definitions used by food standards bodies are clear about what wholemeal and whole grain mean. Wholemeal flour must contain all parts of the original grain, including endosperm, germ and bran in their original proportions. Whole grain ingredients must also contain the components of the whole grain in those same proportions, whether they are milled, cracked or flaked. Nutrition guidance for Australian shoppers is simple. Wheat flour usually means refined white flour. Wholemeal flour means flour with all parts of the grain. The ingredient at the top of the list is present in the greatest amount. So if you pick up a brown loaf from any big brand and the first ingredient is wheat flour with no wholemeal modifier, or a mix that lists wheat flour first and wholemeal wheat flour second, then regardless of how dark the bread looks, it is built mainly on refined flour. Global nutrition articles warn that a lot of brown bread is just white bread with molasses or caramel color added, and they advise people to look for whole wheat flour or wholemeal as the very first ingredient if they want the real thing. Australian writers echo the same advice. Check that wholemeal or whole grain flour is first on the list, and be wary of loaves where white flour dominates and color or seeds just sit on top. See the pattern. Different brand, same playbook. Use a mostly white flour base because it is cheap and easy to work with. Add enough wholemeal, rye or grains to legally justify the name. Use malted barley flour, molasses or other ingredients to push the crumb from pale cream to convincing brown. Wrap it all in rustic, wholesome branding so Australians feel like they have left white bread behind. This is where it stops being about one loaf. It is about a whole system, the pattern hiding in your bread bin. Australian food standards do define wholemeal and whole grain clearly. The issue is not that laws are allowing obvious fakes to slip through. The issue is that the industry has become very good at operating in the grey zone between not technically lying and presenting bread in a way that many shoppers would find surprising if they read the fine print. We went from simple white and simple wholemeal to a wall of products called soft wholemeal, country grain, light rye, mixed grain, high-fiber brown and wholemeal style. And in that shift, something happened. Color took over from content. Texture took over from truth. Nutrition sources point out that real wholemeal and whole grain breads are naturally darker and denser because they contain all parts of the grain. They also remind us that multigrain breads are often just white bread with a mixture of whole grains added, and that in some places brown bread has been colored. Even though rules and labeling in Australia improve transparency, the visual trick of making white-based breads look brown still persists. So if we cannot fully trust color, and we cannot fully trust words like grain and country, what do we trust? We trust the ingredient list, which brings us to the part that actually helps you tomorrow in the bread aisle at Coles or Woolworths. Now let us talk about Australian breads that are actually worth your time. After all that, it is easy to feel like all supermarket bread is a problem. It is not. There are loaves on the shelves that do what they say on the label. You just need to know how to spot them. Here are the 3 things I would look for, and some examples of where they show up. First, wholemeal or whole grain flour as the first and dominant ingredient. Food standards in Australia and New Zealand say that wholemeal flour must contain all parts of the grain. Real wholemeal bread should therefore list wholemeal wheat flour or whole grain wholemeal wheat flour as the first ingredient, and ideally it should make up a large share of the flour. Some big-name loaves actually do this. For example, Tip Top Sunblessed Soft Wholemeal and Tip Top Wholemeal Sandwich Loaves list whole grain, wholemeal wheat flour as the first ingredient, making up around half or a little more of the flour in the recipe, ahead of any plain wheat flour. These loaves are still industrial products. They contain gluten, oil, emulsifiers, and added vitamins. But at least the bulk of the flour is genuinely wholemeal. If I had to choose something quickly from a mainstream shelf, I would start with loaves like this, where the first words in the ingredient list are wholemeal or whole grain wholemeal, and the share of that flour is clearly more than half. That is very different from multigrain or brown loaves, where wheat flour, meaning white flour, is still doing most of the work. Second, visible whole grains and a denser texture. Nutrition writers explain that whole grain breads often use whole, cracked or kibbled grains, not just finely milled flour, and this shows up as visible bits in the crumb. Health-focused resources note that whole grain bread is generally darker and more textured than white bread, and tends to be higher in fiber. So when you are picking a loaf, look through the side of the bag. Can you see actual grains, seeds, and flecks of bran running through the bread? Does it feel a bit heavier for its size? Those are clues that you are dealing with more than dyed fluff. Supermarket brand wholemeal high-fiber loaves can also be a decent starting point. For example, some Woolworths wholemeal and multigrain high-fiber breads combine wholemeal flour, wheat flour, and added wheat fiber to lift the overall fiber content, and they show visible grains in the crumb. Again, it is not perfect. It is a mixed loaf, but at least a meaningful share of the flour is wholemeal, and added wheat fiber boosts the total fiber content. If your choice is between that and a multigrain, where the first ingredient is just wheat flour with grains sprinkled in, the wholemeal high-fiber option is likely the better bet. Third, fewer additives and less engineering. Finally, look at the tail end of the ingredient list. The more you see emulsifiers, thickeners, bread improvers, enzymes, and long lists of added sugars and vegetable oils, the more ultra-processed the loaf is. A simple rule of thumb is that the best everyday breads usually have a wholemeal or whole grain flour first, then water, yeast and salt, and maybe a touch of oil or vinegar. Not a long list of extra ingredients to make the loaf behave like cake. If you have access to a local bakery that bakes true wholemeal or sourdough with visible grains and short ingredient lists, that is often where the real wins are. But even in the big chains, there are loaves that tick more boxes than others, especially the ones with whole grain, wholemeal wheat flour clearly leading the ingredients. These are not sponsored picks. They are simply the types of loaves I would feel much calmer putting in a school lunch or on my own plate compared with multigrain white bread in a brown jacket. Final message and what you can do next. Australian bread culture drifted from simple white and real wholemeal to a wall of engineered products where white flour is dressed up as grain. Brown color is achieved as much through processing and malt as through genuine whole grain content. And texture is softened until the bread behaves more like sponge cake than a grain food. We stopped asking what was in the loaf because we were busy, hungry, and used to trusting that brown meant better. But every time you and I flip that bag over, check the first ingredient, and walk past the loaves where wheat flour and marketing are doing all the work, we push the system back towards honesty. So here is the simple step I would love you to try after this video. Next time you are in Coles, Woolworths or Aldi, pick up your usual bread and ask 3 questions. Is the first ingredient wholemeal or whole grain wholemeal flour, or is it just wheat flour? Can I see actual grains and texture in the crumb, or is it just soft and uniform like white bread in disguise? Does the ingredient list look like food or like a chemistry experiment? If the answers are not what you expected, swap it, even just once, for a loaf where wholemeal or whole grain truly leads. Formulations and recipes can change over time, and brands can update their products. So always check the ingredient list yourself and speak with a qualified health professional if you have medical conditions or specific dietary needs. If you want more deep dives like this into Australian supermarket staples, from bread and eggs to milk, oils and so-called health snacks, hit like and subscribe so we can keep decoding your trolley together. And tell me in the comments, which of these 7 fake wholemeal patterns shocked you the most, and what should we investigate next time you and I walk this aisle together? Stay aware, stay sharp, and protect your plate.